Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping!
Something extraordinary is happening inside China. Xi Jinping could be losing his iron grip over his country. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our big focus today are on those nationwide protests across China. They started gathering momentum in Shanghai, but have now spread in particular to university campuses across the nation. The ostensible resistance is to the draconian zero COVID policy of the Xi Jinping regime as COVID cases surge and draconian lockdowns continue to be in place. But the chants that you hear on the streets of China are step down Xi Jinping. They're young people holding up blank pieces of paper to evade censorship, but actually demanding freedom. And they're actually asking the all powerful Xi Jinping to step down, to step out of the way. Protests that are normal for some parts of our world are extraordinarily difficult inside China. There have been localized pockets of resistance, but perhaps there hasn't been a nationwide protest movement like this since the Tiananmen Square. Some of us are old enough to remember that. I remember having a newspaper clipping of the iconic young man who stood in front of tanks at that time as a generation tried to fight for democracy. We are seeing a similar fight for freedom. Will it be crushed? Remember, a BBC journalist has been beaten and detained. A similar resistance was really captivating global headlines as a young woman stood defiantly eye to eye with the police till she was taken in as well. So, this is something that could, of course, have big geopolitical consequences as well. There's a lot to unpack here as we ask whether this is, in fact, a new Tiananmen Square moment for China, or is that overestimating what's happening? Let's introduce our very, very distinguished panel on the program today. Joining us up first is Jasmine Leung. She's a journalist who's long been chronicling what's happening inside of China. Jasmine, it's good to see you. Also joining us is Aadil Brar. Aadil Brar is an author and columnist with a special focus on China. It's also a great honor to welcome to the program Badiucao. Badiucao is somebody who is globally acclaimed dissident cartoonist. He's been described as the artful dissident who uses his pen, his work of art to take down or at least challenge the regime. It's great to see you, Badiucao. Also joining us is somebody who's one of the world's best known experts on China, Andrew Small, who's with the German Marshall Fund. And last but never the least is our very own favorite general, General Atta Hasnain, a military veteran, a strategic affairs specialist who has served, of course, on the ground as the general officer commanding in the Kashmir Valley. Let's also remember here in India that we continue to have a standoff in eastern Ladakh with the Chinese, and that's very important for us to consider as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be playing you clips and images from inside China. Many of them have gone viral globally. But let me start with you, Badiucao, because you have used, as I said, your art to question the regime for many, many years. And I just want to ask you whether you think something is different about this moment.
Well, I definitely think this protest is something that's so unusual that we haven't been seen since the Tiananmen movement in almost 35 years. This is something really, really extraordinary. I'm saying this because this kind of protest in China, time to time, we see the great movement from Hong Kong in 2009. But this time, we've never seen so many cities spontaneously doing protests again and again. And it's not just lasting one day, it continues. It's creating a circle for itself. Like initially it was a protest for the zero COVID lockdown. Then the second day when some protesters are arrested, then the people will go back to the street and demanding the release of them. So a circle has been created. The first card of the domino has fallen. That is why I do think this is very special.
And you say, Badiucao, that the first card is falling, and we saw some of that artwork there, your brilliant artwork, and we'll see more of it as we go along. But why is this different? Is this about COVID, or is this about something else? Because the chants on the street, Badiucao, are Xi Jinping step down.
Exactly. I mean, the fire actually burning quite early before the 20th Congress. There was this alone protest in Beijing who kind of set a fire on the bridge and putting this giant banner calling the end of the zero COVID as well as calling democracy and Xi Jinping stepping down. He was arrested swiftly, but his image, his video was circulating among China. But by the time, not many people echoing with this alone protest because people are expecting that after maybe Xi Jinping getting his lifelong power during the 20th Congress, then the China will reopen itself. It will ending or ease, at least ease the COVID brutal policy. But the expectation has been frozen with the new wave of locking down. It's really pushing the limitation of people's expectation. The economy is freezing. The young generation, particularly young generation, just don't see the future for themselves. So that is the triggering. But also we see one of the first protests actually happening in Urumqi, Xinjiang, where millions of Uyghurs being sent into the concentration camps. And this is probably the most impossible place that you see such type of great protest happen. So if in such a bad place, people still brave enough to step out to go on the street, then the rest of the city is well echoing. And this is also what we see here. But I also want to highlight this, this is not just Han people, Chinese protesting. We see the uniting between Uyghurs and Han in Urumqi. This is a national-wide campaign.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point that in the areas where the Uyghurs have been interned, these are Muslims who have been kept in camps that violate every single human right. Badiucao making the point that protests have taken place even there. And for our audience, just for context, there was a major fire took place. 10 people died in that fire, and that was, in a sense, the matchstick that lit this forest fire that is now spread across China. Now, Badiucao, you spoke about young people, and I want to play out for our audience an iconic video that has gone viral. You see a young woman, she's actually filming the police, and she's standing defiantly looking at them, almost like the young man who was staring down the tanks at Tiananmen Square. Do watch, and then I'll come back to the panel. So, Jasmine, this reminded me, I'm old enough to remember Tiananmen Square very, very well. And I was in school when it took place. I cut out newspaper clippings and posted them all over my bedroom wall. And when I saw this young woman today, it reminded me of that sort of brave, almost reckless defiance. We don't actually know what will happen to this young woman. Jasmine, what is different about this moment, if there is something different?
I think it's very different, especially when Badiucao talks about it's kind of like a post Tiananmen Square moment, and we're seeing a lot of young people coming out, and they have never experienced Tiananmen Square like most of us here, so they have no experience in holding protests. I mean, having protests in China is not. I mean, it happens locally, but seeing a national-wide and such massive scale, it's a very something that Xi Jinping has to be taking a very extra care of.
Yeah. What is the reason? I ask you the same question. Is it really the COVID management, mismanagement? Is it the sense that the actual number of deaths has been hidden? Or is this people actually, in Iran, for example, the hijab began a movement against the regime. And the hijab was the ostensible reason, but really the movement was deeper, and it was about democracy. Jasmine, what is this movement about?
I would say like the movement, they're calling it as like an A4 revolution, because like you can see youngsters holding white blank papers in defiance of against the Chinese Communist Party. So I would say it was rooted from the frustration against so many months, I mean nearly 3 months of COVID lockdowns, and you could see the initial government response towards the Urumqi fire, where they are blaming the victims for not having a very good good self-protection against fire. So people were very angry about that. But then I could see the young people are generally developing into a stronger sense, like towards disappointment towards the whole government. Apart from COVID, the young people nowadays on Weibo or on other channels, like even on Telegram, they're discussing tactics like used by Hong Kong and Taiwan people, and they're referencing their own pro-democracy movement. For now, I would be very humble to say it may develop into a democracy movement, like demanding a greater human rights protection in China. But we are very close to that now.
And I love your description of it as an A4 revolution. I just want to explain that to our audience who may not have followed that. Basically, we have young people who are holding up blank sheets of paper, A4 size paper. And the fact is that they're blank so that they evade censorship. And they make such a powerful statement. You can see that's an example of it. And this is what's happening at university campuses across China. How do you censor a piece of paper on which nothing is written, and yet so much is written in it not being written? General Hasnain, let me bring you in, not just for context, in India, but also this is geopolitical consequences. China just finished an India-Ocean conclave where India was not present. And this is seen as a counter-quad sort of move. How do you see what's happening? Of course, India is going to be very silent, not comment publicly, officially, but watch this with great interest.
See, Barkha, I just like you remember 1989, Tiananmen Square. And I can say it was different then to what it is now. Today, the world has moved on. Number one, it's an open world, and China itself is facing that openness. There are thousands of students who have studied in the United States, studied internationally, who have also come back to China and are looking for that openness and for that freedom. China, in these kind of moments, there's always a very defining point in time. For example, in Tunisia, it was the suicide by a fruit seller. Here it seems Urumqi. The fire incident in Urumqi seems to be the trigger for all this. But there has been a cascading build-up to all of this, starting from Hong Kong, going on to COVID, and now I think the moment at the current spur in time is actually the World Cup. The audiences in China are seeing the World Cup, seeing unmasked audiences everywhere, people playing, enjoying themselves, while China is under lockdown. China is not enjoying itself like the rest of the world. And that's the difference which it is making. Geopolitically, China is struggling. That something was brewing up in China was very evident for the last 3 months. When we started hearing rumors of a coup d'etat, etc., the overthrow of Xi Jinping losing control. But then everything came back during the 20th Congress, a demonstration. Symbolism seemed to be very, very strong at that time. And we all got led away by this kind of a deduction that Xi Jinping was completely in control. Now it seems that's not very true. And these are symbolics which are happening. This aspect of trying to geopolitically show how strong China is, ability to put up a counter-cord movement, etc. I think India is following the right policy. Just keep quiet on this. Keep quiet. We don't know which direction this is going to flow in, because Tiananmen Square also at that time, if you remember, came all of a sudden. And in China, they will take risks to do anything to save the communist ideology. So I think this is not the time for us to take any decisions. We should just wait and watch, because lots and lots of things are going to happen in China.
Fascinating. I hadn't thought about the World Cup as a possible element in all this. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. Now, before I come to Andrew and Aadil, the chants on the street, it's worth hearing the chorus on the streets, and they're all saying the same thing. Xi Jinping, step down. Listen it.
共产党，共产党，习近平，习近平，习近平，习近平，奉权制，奉权制。
牛逼！
谁呀？解放乌鲁木齐！解放乌鲁木齐！解放乌鲁木齐！解放新疆！解放新疆！解放新疆！解放全中国！解放全中国！解放全中国！解放全中国！解放全中国！解放。
Now, Andrew, you have covered China for decades. Did you think that you would ever see a moment when young people on the street would be saying Xi Jinping step down?
I mean, obviously, this is a surprising juncture, but I mean, this is a context in which Xi Jinping has, in the most recent party congress, swept out virtually every other hint of even margins of difference with other figures in the party. The consolidation of power at the top level was so sweeping. He's put himself in a position in which he's totally surrounded by allies and acolytes. And so who are you going to blame at this stage? This isn't just the party anymore. He's made himself, as it were, chairman of everything. There's no wiggle room to be able to blame anyone else for what's gone on. So naturally in this situation, Xi Jinping becomes a focal point for this. And the problem that he has with this is you have one of two explanations for what's gone on. Either China has been uniquely incompetent at creating the conditions for opening up, which is one explanation, which comes to vaccine levels, the healthcare system, and a whole series of other considerations, or there is a decision on the part of Xi Jinping to maintain this level of societal and political control, that essentially the control measures put in place for COVID are something that the party wants. And so this is a deliberate policy to sustain these measures. And neither of those explanations, by design or incompetence, is one that's particularly good looking for Xi Jinping personally.
And how much force, before I come to Aadil with actually the same question, General Hasnain made an interesting point that China that could crack down on the protesters during Tiananmen Square a few decades ago. Today, there is global scrutiny on it in the way that it wasn't there in those years. Can the regime inflict violence, a brutal crackdown? What's your sense, Andrew?
Sophisticated measures of control than they had back in 1989. And I think in some respects, we had expected to see them, and we will still expect to see some of these measures pursued. I think there's a question. We've had a lull essentially in the last 24 hours in even trying to discern what the party is going to do. It looks as if they're still somewhat in decision-making mode, but these are contingencies that they've prepared for a long time. So, I mean, certainly what I would expect in the first instance will be repressive measures. There will be kind of forceful presence on the streets, as we're already seeing in all the protest sites. There'll be arrests in initially a kind of sweeping way, but a number of people have already been released. There'll almost certainly be attempts to blame ringleaders and foreign forces. There'll be, and there will also, I suspect, be suggestions to, when it comes to the actual enforcement of some of the COVID-related measures, not to take steps that are going to further inflame protests in some, because this has in some respects been down to very specific enforcement measures that have been taken in specific locations in the first instance. So I mean, there are steps that I think they will take. There's there is a question, though, as to whether this will simply be, as one would expect, a view that Xi Jinping will take, that this demonstrates that society has not been disciplined enough in China. One needs to go harder. This proves that the youth are ill-disciplined, and precisely the measures that COVID control was supposed to demonstrate. If anything, this only proves that one needs to go harder in response. And that, of course, has been the approach that the Communist Party has pursued so far. There's nothing to suggest that Xi Jinping will do anything other than that.
And the question, therefore, Aadil, to you would be, this is a country that hasn't pretended to be a democracy. This is a country where an estimated 1 million Uyghurs have been in internment camps, and hence Badiucao's point that protests are happening in those areas as well is very, very important. But the world hasn't been able to do very much. By the way, if we take those banners off, that's some of Badiucao's brilliant artwork. I just want to, can we take the banner off so we can see it properly? Just want you all to have a glimpse at how his images have actually taken on issues of democracy and curtailment. Look at that. That's a tank dressed up in a PPE kit with a single person standing in front of it. Tiananmen Square really reimagined there in Badiucao's artwork. And those are the A4 blank sheets that young people are standing with, to which Jasmine made a reference. Extremely stirring artwork there by Badiucao. But let me actually, Aadil, just bring you in before I go back to him. China doesn't pretend to be a democracy. China's never cared for global sort of opinion. China's carried on the back of its sheer might, its control of markets globally. Even in India, we've wrestled with that question. So would Xi Jinping care that the world is watching this so closely?
I think Xi Jinping is feeling a sense of hubris right now, what we saw with the 20th Party Congress, and he basically let go the Shanghai party chief Li Qiang, who was promoted to become the premier of China. And if you remember what happened sometime earlier this year when there was a Shanghai lockdown, and a lot of people were expecting that he might do something by disciplining the officials, but that never happened. So now she has created a precedent where he doesn't have a room to kind of find out who's going to be the next scapegoat. So that's where he is at the moment stuck. And if he had done something in the past, then he would have had an opportunity to send out officials to maybe do something about what's going on. But he does not have that room that he can maneuver. So therefore, this overconfidence in China's ability to self-correct is something that will lead towards more mistakes that we might see in the coming week as the protests go on. And we saw with how Xi Jinping went up to Justin Trudeau and kind of reprimanded him. And that tells you how he feels about international affairs, and he feels that he can manage these affairs by relying on internal policing, by relying on allies who are willing to stand by him, and they don't really care how people think about democracy and human rights. It's all about making sure Xi Jinping remains in power. So that is the kind of system that he has built, and I don't think that he will quickly crack down on the protests. This might be allowed to kind of pan out and then eventually bring in the forces to completely make it disappear. And that will send a message to the others that if you try to do something in the future, we have the capability to send you to the jail and take measures to control this kind of protest. And that's the kind of message I think Xi Jinping might make happen. And we saw with what happened with Hu Jintao, where he made a whole situation where Hu Jintao was pulled out in front of the people. So I don't think he really cares about what the world thinks.
So before I come to Badiucao and Jasmine, for whom this is much more personal than it is for us who remain chroniclers from the outside in some ways, General Hasnain, if Xi Jinping doesn't care, how does this moment become a tipping point, or does it, or do we not know?
That question is for me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I do think that Xi Jinping has the capability at the moment to play this out, in the sense to resist it. Because he knows, for one, by putting sanctions against China is something out of the question, right? The supply chain system will probably paralyze the rest of the world if you start putting sanctions on China. So China controls a lot of the international monetary system, perhaps lots of issues connected with economics. And therefore, that is where the hubris, which is being spoken about by Aadil, is very much there. And he probably thinks that he can ride this out. I think the lessons he may learn from Tiananmen from 1989 is, don't play it too quickly. And I think that's exactly what Aadil also just said. Don't play it out too quickly. You try and create a turbulence, you try and hit at this time, the world will come down on you, maybe not physically, not in terms of sanctions and measures, but opinion, in terms of opinion. And China wants opinion on its side too. So I think Xi Jinping is going to play this very, very slowly by putting down a lot of clampdowns on information, internet clampdowns, and things like that. And information flow is something which is going to be controlled to a very great extent. In today's world, it is possible. He may experiment with that. It was not possible in 1989, but that is very much possible today. And I think that's the manner. Violence, counter-violence, I don't think is something which Xi Jinping can afford at this time as a part of his image building either. He wants to play out the long game. Remember, he's looking at 2035. And it's not a kind of an image which you last with for 14 years, having killed lots and lots of people in the streets of Shanghai or in Beijing or any other place like that. So that's the manner in which I think his strategy is going to play out.
That's very interesting that this is actually going to become like a psyop, like a psychological warfare and information warfare. And China has never hesitated to clamp down on, for example, the typical social media networks that most of us use in other parts of the world, whether it's WhatsApp or others. And I want to go back to Badiucao and Jasmine. Badiucao, to you first. You know, we're all having a conversation that is academic in some ways, but for you, you are a dissident, and there is a cost, as it were, to being a dissident. And I want you to speak a little bit from your personal experience, what these last few years have been for you. Have you felt scared for yourself? Have you felt scared for your family? What are the kind of pressures that have been brought to your doorstep? You know, I'm sure our audiences here in South Asia in particular would love to know. Badiucao.
Well, I have been kind of self-exiled for quite a long time, that I will not be able to come back to China or even near Hong Kong without being arrested or disappeared by the National Security Police. My family in China have been harassed by the police all the time. Even when I'm, thousands of miles away from China, doing exhibition in Europe, in Australia, in America, that the Chinese embassy and the consulate will constantly throwing pressure and harassment to me personally, but also to the local government, to the museum, to the gallery, to stop my exhibition. I have to say that now, with the growing of China's influence, it is not just personal to me, a Chinese dissident artist, but also it has everything to do with every citizen around the world, in the democracy, in the West, in India, in any other countries. What we're seeing, China has grown from authoritarian regime become the totalitarian regime. It is waging threatening globally, not just economic pressure, but also with the potential war that happening between China and Taiwan, an invasion that happening in Taiwan, then it certainly poses a world threat to the peace, to everyone. So I actually want to highlight this. This revolution, protest, nationwide movement that happening in China is actually also the business of all of us who are not in China, because only a democratic China will be a force for the peace of the world. An authoritarian regime, a dictatorship of China, meaning that the world peace will always be in danger.
Do you think you could ever? You said today, if you went back even till Hong Kong, you would be arrested or disappeared, which is of course a metaphor for something even more dire than being jailed. Do you think you could ever go back to China in your lifetime, Badiucao?
Well, I think with the development at this moment, seeing all the protests in every cities, especially the younger generation's passion, that I do see the hope now. I see hope more than any time.
That's powerful. Before I go to Jasmine and Andrew, I just want to play another set of your very powerful images. Remember, this protest is taking place in the context of the zero COVID policy. Can we please play those pictures and just take the banner off there? You see how Badiucao uses the PPE kit as a kind of symbol of weaponization by the state. And in particular, an image that we'll just see of a tank that is draped in a PPE kit with a lone man standing in front of it. There it is. It's so powerful. It really takes you back to Tiananmen, but in a new sort of way. Badiucao, talk a little bit about these images and and what you're trying to convey. Some of us, of course, have been following the protest, but for others who may not have been.
I think every protest that happened in history, even though it got cracking down, even though it had to experiencing massacre and losing the hope for the moment, but it's serving a very much long purpose for the future. And this is exactly why I would referencing the Tiananmen massacre and the movement and the brave tank men and connecting the history to this moment, to now the protest at this moment. I think it's very important that we remember those moments and carrying the fires. All those inspiration joined from 1989, but also from the Hong Kong protests in 2019 and now, and nothing has been wasted. Even though a lot of people, sacrifice their lives, a lot of people go to the jail. It seems like the previous protests never success, but it buried a seed and it's growing now, and it will become a tree, become a forest.
A seed that might become a tree or a forest. Before I come to Jasmine, Andrew, the world, or rather the Western world, has its hands full with Russia, Ukraine. And now it's got this conflagration, possible conflagration in China. Biden has been under pressure for not being tough enough on China. There are questions about whether Trump would have handled it better, differently. Certainly, Trump, who's declared his candidature for 24, will say that. How do you think the West might respond to this moment, Andrew?
I think there's going to be a lot of care in the first instance not to play into the narratives around foreign hands. I think there's going to be a huge level of concern, given that these are indigenous, internally driven protests, not to give any fuel to the fire that this is being excessively kind of pushed or egged on by outside forces. So I think that is going to be an important factor in the first instance. The second element of it is going to be, it depends on what measures are actually pursued against the protesters. Of course, if there's a certain scale of repression that takes place, then people will stand up and make statements and take measures. And I certainly don't think that in some circumstances would exclude sanctions or other measures. I think it will absolutely depend on what the response actually is to that. It is to the protests. Of course, privately, people will be wishing this very well. I mean, that's going to be the general view in Western governments, I would still say, for the most part. I think there's just going to be a lot of concern not to do active damage to the movement, but at the same time, people right now, talking to government officials at present, they're still trying to determine the dynamics. I mean, there's a lot of kind of, right now, this is a kind of analytical juncture to try and figure out what's going on, what the likely prospects are. This has caught people by surprise. So I don't think there's a determinate answer yet beyond a couple of those kind of broad senses of inclination in the part of Western governments.
And to the extent that everybody's been caught by surprise speaks to the organic nature of these protests, which make them actually much more powerful than anything organized possibly could be. I want, Jasmine, you to respond to something very interesting General Hasnain raised, that this is going to be contested at the level of information. It's not easy anymore to be beating up young people on the streets who are just standing there with a blank piece of paper. What are you picking up from young people you've been speaking to or chronicling? I know you'd be tracking what's happening on social media as well inside China. What are you picking up, and how uncensored is that space right now, at least online, for young people to be expressing themselves freely?
I think just take a reference to Chinese Twitter, Weibo. So basically, a lot of people are taking the platform to express their opinion, and for example, like some youngsters are using Cantonese, which is a dialect from Chinese, from Mandarin, and then actually can type into a different type of language on Weibo, and to being avoid from being censored by the media. I think another point of young people that we're seeing, like a lot of young people are actually have a very mixed feelings. Some of them are blaming that the whole protest movement was being brought by foreign people, just like what Andrew said. And some people are blaming that it belongs to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has a history of a very aggressive pro-democracy movement in 2019. So I think the feelings for now is very mixed for young people, but definitely they are seemingly to want to unite with other dissidents in Hong Kong and Taiwan, as they think there's a saying in Chinese, so there's like blossoms everywhere. So especially for now, like I would like to add the point that I think Xi Jinping will find some people as a scapegoats to kind of solve the issue. But whether it will be successful, I think that's a very challenging question for everyone to answer now.
Okay, that's an interesting thought that Xi Jinping might, in fact, seem to be responding to the people instead of cracking down on them. And this could cause heads to roll. But Xi Jinping insulating himself. But let's also remember, Aadil, that the chants on the street, while some are about the CCP, they're actually about Xi Jinping personally. And let's also talk about the opacity with which China has responded to COVID, whether it's the origins of the virus, whether it's how many people have died, and whether it is the contested efficacy of its China made vaccine.
Of
Can we
the
unmute Aadil?
commentary
Yeah, go
coming
ahead.
out of
Sorry, just repeat that, Aadil.
if you listen to some of the slogans coming out of the protests, you can come across some of the slogans which talk about media freedom, and that media freedom is tied to the COVID response. Getting information on time. Where are the red zones in China where COVID is spreading? And also the health code, which has become a big issue, which is tying down the local governments against the Beijing government. So there's that conflict going on as well. They say that we get these instructions from the top, so we have to implement the COVID response. And so that disconnect is something that's making people ask for more transparency in terms of journalism and communication. And that is something we've never seen before. So it's no longer just, this one thing about COVID. And that is what is bringing Xi Jinping directly into the firing line, because he's the one who has decided, and people understand that he's behind these kind of controls, these very strong controls, which can only be explained as some sort of legalistic tool to discipline people. There's no other explanation. Though, as Andrew mentioned, we don't know exactly what is driving the CCP's thinking, but we can fairly certainly say that there is an aspect of disciplining that's going on. How she talks about the youth, which is kind of not ready for the new world that China is building. And he needs the youth to be more active, to fight in the military, to be out there. So he's trying to create this narrative, and that's exactly what's bringing the youth in the firing line and Xi Jinping on the other side.
It is perhaps a situation that can't be clearly forecast. But General Hussain, very briefly before I give Badiucao the last word, there has been a prolonged military conflagration between our country, India, and the Chinese in the Upper Himalayas, and there has been a stalemate, for many months now. What should we be looking out for? Is this the time when Xi will be too busy with his own backyard? What is the immediate set of consequences? What happens to the Quad? We saw both India and Australia, as I mentioned, skipping the so-called Indian Ocean Forum that China hosted. Your sense, sir?
Well, as far as the high Himalayas are concerned, the Chinese tried something in April, May 2020 to divert attention from what they were suffering from in terms of COVID, and hoped that the world would start focusing at other things and forget China. And they didn't succeed anyway. And you found that actually, despite that, India succeeded in controlling COVID. The world actually recognized Indian efforts. Our vaccine efforts were recognized and praised. So in all ways, if you really look at it, India came out the far better. For China, therefore, to do a repeat of something like that, to try and divert attention, it's what a lot of people are talking about, to my mind, it seems very, very remote. What is always possible is that there is dissidence within the PLA, dissidence within the political ranks in China, and someone tries to do something awkward on the line of actual control, or maybe perhaps in other parts of conflict where China is involved, to try and divert that kind of attention, to try and complicate and make this whole issue much more complex than what it already is. That kind of a possibility still remains live. But I don't think officially Xi Jinping as such would like to step in and do anything which is going to make this whole issue more complicated. They would want to make it far more simpler to respond to the situation as it pans out, because we're not seeing the end of it at the moment. This is going to last for a fair amount of time unless crackdowns start taking place and this whole thing breaks out into some kind of a very violent, turbulent movement. Then no one can really predict what will happen. As far as the counter to the Quad, etc., is concerned, as it is, we are seeing a reasonable degree of quiet, in silence, in fact, towards
Yeah.
towards the Indo-Pacific with what's happening in Ukraine and other areas. So I don't think too much of attention is going to be really paid to that. India missing, Australia missing from
Yeah.
these kind of conferences, etc. At the moment, these are all quieter things, I think. The real
Yes.
preeminence is going to be now the streets of China. For the next
Absolutely.
7-10 days, I think that's where the focus is going to be.
So on that note, let me give Badiucao the last word. Who's hopeful? You're hopeful that maybe, as you said, a seed becomes a tree becomes a forest. But Jasmine's point that Xi Jinping could just insulate himself by making sure that some mid-level functionaries or maybe someone little senior than that, some heads roll. Xi Jinping actually looks like a responsive leader, but the chants on the street are really targeted at him. So will that work, Badiucao?
Well, I think the opportunity is in the hands of the people. That we've already seen that for so many years, China is such a quiet place. You don't see massive protests, but this is the very first step after several decades. For me, that's a difference from 0 and 1. Of course, we cannot hope just one protest, one strike will completely change China. But this 0 to 1 change, this first step, has become a very important change that in China people's minds, that stepping on the street and protest is no longer out of the option, and that's most important things. Of course, we are expecting, tear gas, batons, even bullets, tanks possible in the future, but we still have the hope in the people's hearts. And I want to highlight, this is not just about China's rights, it's about universal human rights. So I want to call in the international society focusing on this news, supporting the people from China, because this is also your rights.
And powerfully said that young people today are bracing themselves for bullets, for tanks, possibly, certainly for tear gas and batons. But young people are determined. Revolutions everywhere are led by the young. They don't always work, but it is the young, because there's a moral force that the young carry. And remember, these are peaceful protests. Once it's very important to underline that all people are doing are standing there with pieces of paper that say nothing but say everything. A lot like Badiucao, your art that says so much. Thank you to Jasmine and Badiucao in particular, to Andrew, Aadil, and General Hussain for your time, and to your audience. We'll keep tracking this story very, very closely, and we hope to have many of you back with us again. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.